and good evening, everybody. I suppose my first question is a kind of to paint a picture of inclusive education from the department's point of view. I know you say the NCSE has produced a document that was some months ago and it's been considered by the ministers. So I suppose it's to know what that looks like, because the UNCRPD and the UNCRC both want inclusive education, but that makes some parents very, very nervous, especially parents of children with profound or complex disability. I suppose as well to ask, was there consultation with parents and or children around that, or will there be, in looking at that? Because I actually attended a book launch or a report launch by As I Am yesterday called Exploring the School Experiences of Autistic Children and Young People, and I know the CEO of the NCSE was there. I'm not sure if there was somebody from the department, but it was very interesting, and it's where young autistic adults are given their opinions on school and what the school experience is like or has been like for them, and the different things that they come up against. And I suppose even something as simple as uniforms. You know, they have sensory issues, so uniforms, you know, shouldn't always be of one type or another, that should be taken into account. They would have talked about the misunderstanding of staff of what autism is. So, I mean, staff training and awareness and understanding of autism is extremely important. Like one student said, an SNA said to her, "You don't look autistic," right? Another parent told me one day that when she told her primary school teacher that she thought her daughter might be autistic and she was going to have her assessed, the teacher said to her, "But she speaks." So that shows a very clear misunderstanding of autism by people in the education sector that should know better. And so it's just about, you know, to maybe expand on how you will roll out more understanding and awareness of disability in general and autism in particular, because the prevalence of autism is increasing dramatically. And I suppose, would you see a situation where you can move away from expensive assessments required to get into school for children on the spectrum or children with needs? They're very difficult to access at the moment, and parents are paying out large amounts of money, up to €1,500, maybe €2,000, to have their child assessed, just so that the child will get into an autism class or into a special school and be able to access the supports they need. Without it, they can't at the moment. So I don't know, is there any way we'll ever move away from that, or another way of doing it so that parents aren't paying out so much money, especially when the CDNTs are in what I would term disarray. And I don't want to hold the thing, but I'm very interested in your social inclusion model. I've said that before, and I know you're saying it's going to be rolled out. I just want you to maybe expand on how that's going to be rolled out. You say among the NCSE staff and support staff. I mean, from what I'm hearing from the NCSE, it has worked well in the schools where it's been piloted. And that the biggest difficulty was getting staff because it was a pilot scheme, and therefore there was a lack of permanency around the positions. So I'm just wondering, is that going to change? Is it going to be properly assessed, and is it going to be rolled out on a larger scale? I have several other questions, but look, I'll let other members come in, and maybe if there's opportunity to come back in later as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy. And on behalf of the Department, we're delighted to be here this evening and having the opportunity to deal with the issues that you'd like raised. I think you've covered a lot of issues there, Deputy, so if it's okay with you, I'll try and go through them one by one and then hand over to some of my colleagues who'll be able to give you a little bit more detail. In relation to the inclusive education, and I suppose painting the picture of what we see, you're very correct in that the concerns of parents of children in special classes and special schools are very legitimate. The Department fully recognises those. We are very conscious that our special schools play an enormously valuable role in our education system. We value them hugely. We've opened 7 new special schools, as you know, in the last number of years. We're increasing the number of places in existing special schools. So from the Department's perspective, we see an incredibly valuable and ongoing important role for our special schools in the Irish education system. When we look at inclusive education, I think it's important to say 97% of all our children are educated in mainstream settings with teachers and SNAs. We have almost 40,000 staff supporting those children in our mainstream settings between special education teachers and special need assistants. We have increased significantly. We have almost 3,000 special classes in our mainstream schools. And I think, Deputy, if you look at what is a special class, it's teachers and SNA working within a mainstream building. So that can and should be a very inclusive environment, in that our definition of success there would be for the children to be spending maximum amount of time within the mainstream setting that they're able to, acknowledging that they should obviously be availing of the support of the special class as they need it. What we would love to see is that children being able to access as much of the mainstream with their peers and their siblings as possible, acknowledging that that won't work for everybody. So I think it's really important that in looking at a future vision, we are not looking to do away with the parts of the education system that are working really well, and our special schools are central to that important work, and we want to make sure that we support people. So when we talk about a vision for the future, a longer term plan, we acknowledge that right now the value in our school system of our mainstream, of our special classes and special schools, and that's something very much that we're holding on to. In relation to the what engagement there has been with parents and children, obviously that initial work was undertaken by the NCSE. We obviously have ongoing engagement with parents and with young people. We have a new parent and learner unit within the department that's focusing on the voice of the child. We can talk to you a little about the groups that we support in terms of advocacy and parents groups that we've established engagement with in the department. I think something that's particularly important to flag to you is just the capturing the voice of everybody in the system about the value of education has been in our review of the EPSAN Act. So as you know, we commenced a review of the EPSAN Act recently. It's been an incredibly positive experience in terms of capturing, we've put a huge amount of work in relation to capturing the voice of all of the stakeholders, so that we're talking about people currently in the system, staff, children in the system, children who've left the system. We had over 28,000 responses to our online consultation, and my colleague Frank can talk a little bit more about that, but that is really ensuring that we capture the voice of children and young people. In relation to our staff training and ensuring that staff in schools are very much aware of I suppose supporting children and young people with disabilities, particularly autism, my colleague Jill, we can talk a little bit about our initial teacher training and then the supports that the NCSE and our CPD teams have on that. In relation to the prevalence of autism, we're very conscious that autism is significantly, the prevalence of it is growing. We had initially been working off figures in terms of our forward planning provision of, based on figures that the Department of Health would have had back in 18 and 19 of 1.8%. We see that there are figures internationally of significantly greater, and in planning, forward planning, and I know we've talked to you a little bit previously about that, in our forward planning processes on ensuring that we have enough special school and class provision, we're actually working off much higher percentages to ensure that we have enough special schools and classes, and we have had enough special schools and classes in recent years to meet the need. In relation to the assessments, we're very conscious that the children who are in our special schools and special classes have complex need. We want to ensure that the children who access those classes are the children with the most complex need, and so we acknowledge that there is an importance in them having access to assessments from the HSE, because their needs are greater than education. They obviously need speech and language and occupational therapy and respite. But we are looking internally at what we can do to move away from the assessment. We've moved away from assessments for all of our mainstream provision, so the only component that still requires an assessment is our special schools and classes. We're looking at better ways to support transitions for people who already have them, and at alternative ways to get in. And we can talk to you a little bit about our school inclusion model in relation to how that can roll out. But just conscious of the time, what I might do first is I might just ask Frank just to give us a quick update on EPSAN, and then maybe Jill just to talk about the initial teacher training, and then maybe Brendan just to give you a quick update on the same, if that's all right. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, Deputy, the EPSAN review, we're going through a huge consultation phase at the moment, and the kind of things you're talking about in terms of engaging children with autism, with other disabilities, is a really important part of that. So we had our online consultation and we had 28,000 responses to that, and a huge number of open submissions as well. So we've gone through the online submissions, and we've taken on board I suppose the submissions that we've got from a huge number of stakeholders and groups. And they're going to now feed into a range of focus groups. And I think this is going to be the critical part of the review, because the most important part of those focus groups is getting the voice of the child and the voice of people who actually lived through the experience of being in school every day and finding out exactly what it is that their thoughts are around it. So we have an advisory group as part of the EPSM work, and that's been really important and informative for us in terms of working through the best way of doing this. So we'd have a lot of stakeholders from disability groups. So you mentioned As I Am, and we're actually working closely with As I Am in terms of, I suppose, best accessing those children with autism, for instance, who can give us a real insight into what it means to live under that legislation. So when we're finished those focus groups, that really will feed into then the overall recommendations that we want to put forward as to what the EPSM Act might look like in the future. So it's likely to be early next year when we have that report ready. There's so much submissions and consultation phase that we just want to take our time and make sure that we get all those voices heard and that we get the best possible input into what happens with that legislation in the future.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So the committee will be aware that there are quite a number of HEIs, higher education institutes in Ireland, providing initial teacher education for qualification and subsequent registration as a teacher at primary and post-primary level. So all of those programmes of education, of initial teacher education provided by the HEIs have to be accredited by the Teaching Council and meet certain standards. In 2020, the Teaching Council developed a new set of standards for initial teacher education, and that's called CAME. What it sets out to do, and building on the previous set of standards, which were probably about 10 years old or thereabouts, is to develop further the strengths and the skills that teachers on qualification need to have. So the CAME booklet sets out 7 core elements which must underpin all aspects of programmes of initial teacher education. One of those is inclusive education. There are others like global citizenship education, professional relationships, and working with parents, which is quite important in this context as well, I think, professional identity and agency, creativity, reflective practice, literacy and numeracy, and digital skills. But I suppose in terms of inclusion, it's very clear that must underpin all aspects of programmes of initial teacher education. Individual HEIs will give effect to that in different ways. So each programme will vary depending on the method that the provider has decided to put in place. All of the programmes are at a very advanced stage of accreditation. Some have been accredited already under the CAME standards, and the remainder are being done now. So I think at the end of this year, the Council would expect to have pretty much all of the programmes through the revised accreditation process under CAME. And I suppose just to set out, there's a small quote in relation to CAME regarding an inclusive approach to teachers' practice, which recognises the diverse needs that teachers will encounter throughout their career, including additional learning needs, for example, autism, dyslexia, dyspraxia, as well as needs associated with linguistic, socio-economic and cultural backgrounds. So kind of broad brush of inclusion there. The Minister earlier this year published an initial teacher education policy statement, and that again sets out to even build on the CAME standards and to look at, well, how are the HEIs putting into practice these standards that are set out under CAME. So there's a number of actions in there in relation to inclusion and strengthening the student-teachers experience around inclusion, some of which relate to maybe having a school placement setting in a special education setting, but as well as that, asking the Teaching Council to report to the Department and to the Minister in the first half of 2024, after all of the ITE programmes have been through their accreditation cycle, as to how that element of inclusive education is being embodied, I suppose, in those programmes. So I think that's the up-to-date position. And we have about 2,000 each of primary and post-primary initial teacher education students going through the system and graduating each year.
Thanks, Chair. And firstly, it's disappointing to hear teachers' remarks around young people with autism, and I suppose it's an indicator of how we need to progress the model of inclusion in our system. But it is a very, I suppose it's a deep and philosophical question, like what do we mean when we talk about an inclusive education system? I'm Ireland's rep on the European Agency for Special Needs and Inclusive Education, so I've quite detailed conversations with colleagues from a whole range of jurisdictions about what system is in place in your jurisdiction, how is it progressing, how is it moving, and so on. I think what's interesting to note is that even in systems which we would regard as being far more inclusive perhaps than the Irish model, say for example Portugal or Malta or Italy, where Italy they don't have special schools, for example, it's not that children with severe or profound learning disabilities are to be found in mainstream classes, for example, because that doesn't meet anybody's need. So they retain specialist provision. Even in fully inclusive or more inclusive education systems, there are specialist provisions. They call them resource centres. They don't call them special schools, but for all intents and purposes, they remain as special schools, which will be staffed by specialist teachers and well supported by the range of therapists and others that is deemed necessary. So I think, in respect of, you're correct in that I think some parents would be fearful of a model of inclusion which would result in children with more complex special education needs in with their peers, in mainstream classes, surrounded by supports, adult supports and so on. I don't think that's what we're talking about, because that doesn't serve the purpose of the child or the teachers or the other students in the school. So whatever model of inclusion emerges, it has to be based on one that is agile and is capable of responding to the individual needs of the young people, the children and the young people, so that the programs of education are tailored to the needs of those children. I think that's really important to note, and we've a way to go, clearly, but as Martina has said, we've massive investment in our in special education over the last number of years. So I think the challenge for us is to build on that. We have 20,000 teachers working in special ed that most of whom didn't work in special ed 15, 20 years ago. So, and there's 20,000 SNAs and so on and so forth. So huge investment in training teachers and all that type of thing. So, there's a lot there to be built upon. And I think that's certainly one of the things that we would bear in mind in terms of what we would consider a model of inclusion. It's one that meets our system needs and so on. The other aspect of inclusion, I think there's also there's a feeling abroad, perhaps sometimes, that all of the expertise around special education resides in special schools. And, children have to go to special schools because that's where all of the expertise remains. That's frequently true, but it's not always necessarily true. So I think, the policy position of the department in respect of meeting the needs of children and young people is that where possible, they would attend mainstream provision. And where that's not possible, then the special classes or special schools are provided in order to assist them and to meet their needs. So just on SIM, I think it is important to note that there are constituent elements of SIM beyond just the therapists, and you rightly referred to challenges in respect of finding sufficient therapists there are 39 sanctioned posts, for example, in NCSE. In occupational therapists and speech and language therapists, and it's been very difficult for those posts to be filled, possibly because they've been filled on a year-to-year basis, and that is possibly one of the issues in respect of the challenge. But we have a proposal which we're working through at the moment, submitted by NCSE in respect of scaling up one element of SIM, and I can talk about other elements. We had a nursing element to SIM, we had a SNA element, a NEPS element, and a therapy element. But specifically in respect of therapy, there's a proposal which would see scaling up as a first phase, scaling up of a national therapy service to mainstream schools. Now we're engaging with the colleagues in DEEPR on that, so we don't know whether we'll be able to progress it. But I think certainly, from the department's perspective, the wind is behind that particular model. I just entirely coincidentally happened to bump into an inspector at lunchtime in the office, and she recounted how she'd been in a school in rural Wicklow, one of the 75 pilot schools. And she just referred to the extraordinary impact of having an occupational therapist available to the school, not to the children per se specifically, but to work collaboratively with the teacher as a means of building their capacity to meet the needs of the children, and with a real strong emphasis on the development of fine motor skills in a way that the teacher simply wouldn't have been prepared for or trained to do. So we do recognise, I mean, it's the fundamental basis on which we have our speech and language classes, for example. We recognise the benefit of a co-professional relationship between the teacher and therapists. Both will benefit. There's a mutually beneficial relationship to be developed in that regard. So I think the challenge for us is in respect of how do we build the capacity of teachers more generally.
Because it is important that everybody speaks about it, but
Sorry for the interruption. It was the monitor, it said. Sorry.
Oh, okay. So I think ultimately that's our challenge. But the other elements of SIM are equally as important. The additional NEPS support to the schools. I mean, you're probably familiar with the NEPS model of service, 80% assessment and 20% capacity building. So having 4 additional NEPS psychologists available to the schools has also proved to be very beneficial. The nursing pilot, as originally envisaged as part of the SIM, has morphed. It doesn't look as it was proposed because originally it was proposed just for the SIM area, and when we engaged with the HSE, the numbers simply weren't there. So that we've developed that. I don't know if you're familiar with our nursing pilot, but we've expanded it to a national focus as opposed to just the SIM, because when we went to the HSE, there was when they crunched the numbers and came back to us, essentially there are about 25 children in the country, according to the HSE, that require nursing supports in order to attend school. So we have put in place a separate programme to progress that.
Are those children all in special schools? Or?
No, they could be in any school at all. In some of them maybe in special schools, but equally it could be it could be somebody who is recovering from a car accident or something like that and requires the criterion for the main criterion for access to the program is 20 hours of what they call PHCP, Pediatric Home Care Package. So once the child has been sanctioned for that by the HSE, they can then apply for nursing support to be provided, additional nursing support to be provided in the school setting. So it's in its early stages, but it's beneficial.
If you don't mind, I might just add, because I think, Deputy, you raised a very important question about the teachers that are already in the system and how they're supporting the children. And Jill talked a little bit about the initial teacher training, but obviously continuous professional development and training for the teachers in the system. So our national agency now, EDGE, which was previously our PDST and our JCT and education centres, they're now in a single entity called EDGE, which is providing ongoing CPD. So they obviously provide online and face-to-face courses, but there's also funding for 295 teachers per year on a postgraduate diploma in special education at a level 9. That includes block release for 8 weeks for face-to-face engagement. There's 18 places on the DCU postgraduate certificate for pupils on the autism spectrum. There is also funding for 25 teachers on the St Angela's postgraduate certificate and diploma in professional development. And separately, the NCSE provide a lot of training. So in 2022, over 5,226 teachers participated in professional development and learning with the NCSE. And I suppose, so what I'm saying is that there's a huge, we're not just focusing on the initial teacher training, obviously that's very important, but we want to ensure that all the teachers in the system, we're finding a way to support them as well. So thank you, Chair.
Deputy Canny did mention about the Irish language, and I was going to raise that issue as well, because 11% of post-primary pupils in the 2021-2022 year were exempt from studying Irish. Now, I recognise that some of those would be students who came to the country after the age of 11, but there would have been some exempt because of additional learning needs. And I know he talked about the policy document that's with the Department and with the Minister at the moment, but are you familiar with the Common European Framework of References for Languages? Because it's just a different way of looking at how you teach and how you assess the language. So instead of it being based on the written, which would be difficult for someone with a learning difficulty, that it would be based on their oral and whatever the proficiency is, that there would be a different assessment. Because let's face it, the way the Irish language is taught in this country is disgraceful anyway. And I mean, I went through 13 years of school, and unless you go to a Gaelic school, you come out, most of us cannot speak the language. So I mean, I think it needs to be revised anyway as our national language. But even, you know, to allow that children with additional learning needs can learn some aspects of the language, whether it's just a little bit of the spoken language or whatever. Parents of gifted children have been in touch with me. I mean, we've over 30,000 children who are gifted in this country or exceptionally able, and there's no additional provisions for them unless their ability is, unless they have a learning difficulty as well. So, and I suppose that ties in a little bit with children who have maybe dyslexia or dyspraxia or dyscalculia. And if their academic ability is above a certain percentile, they don't qualify for resources or even assistive technology, even though it might be recommended by the assessment. And I think that's unfair because these children are struggling. So they might be able, they might be very willing and interested in learning, but it is difficult because they're not getting the additional support to cope with their dyslexia. And I have parents tell me that the child is maybe masking at school a little bit, like, it's neurodiversity as well, they're masking the fact that they're not keeping up with their classmates, but it's taken their toll on them. And I'm just wondering, is that something that can be changed? Because, you know, no matter what your ability is academically, if you have dyslexia or whatever it is, you deserve some support. And the last thing that wasn't mentioned here was summer provision. It's so important to the families and the children with additional needs, but it's got to where the children with the most need are not getting the provision. And Special Schools and Special Classes Parents Group sent on testimony from parents about the effect it had on the child and the family over the summer. You know, some families got no provision at all, and it was just a hectic 8 or 9 or 10 weeks. Some got 2 weeks or 4 weeks, and they said that was brilliant. But even the remaining month of August was very difficult for them. And I'm just wondering, is there any way? I know there's lots of funding allocated to it, but there are many schools who are not willing to do it. I was part of the Autism Committee, and we did try and push this issue. And we did, you know, see an increase in the uptake by schools. But again, not all schools offer the full 4 weeks, or not all schools offer it at all. Even our special schools don't. So. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deputy. I'm just conscious in relation to the Irish language that my colleagues from the Curriculum and Assessment Unit and my colleagues in the Irish Language Unit will be better able to describe to you how we're approaching this, including for children with special educational needs. So with the Chair's permission, we might come back to you in writing on that issue, because I think it's important, given the range of work that's happening, that the people who could best describe it to you, who aren't here with us today, can come back to you on that. I'm going to ask Brendan in a minute just to talk to you about the gifted children, because I think it's something we're very conscious of as well. I know when we come to committees, we talk about children with complex needs. It tends to be that we look as if we're focusing just on the children in special schools and special classes, on the children with a more complex need, but actually our work is to ensure that all children with special educational needs, about 25% of all children in our school system have a special educational need of some kind. So we want to ensure that the resources and supports we provide are meeting the need across that. And that includes, for example, children with dyslexia. And again, in talking maybe about the gifted children, Brendan might just touch on how our mainstream supports are also working. In relation to the summer programme, I think we just want to be, I suppose, we really appreciate the work that the Autism Committee did in this regard. It brought a real focus to the summer programme. That was very helpful to us, and Frank works very closely with the Open Special Schools and Classes and all the advocacy groups, and that advocacy group focus was really very heavily attention on the summer programme for the last year, and we know it will be again. We got funding in budget in the budget which will allow us to have that very expanded summer programme again this year. I think that's really important. We're now at the point that half of all special schools are doing it, and that's where the children with the most complex needs are. We've seen an over 300% increase in the number of people who've participated in it since 2019. So we know that there's more to be done, but we have seen really big increase in numbers, and Frank can talk to you a little bit about that. Part of what we've also tried to do is, in acknowledging that not all the schools do it, is to look at other ways that we could get parents being able to access it. So we've had small group providers, and we've made changes where we've worked with certain coordinator for the special school. So I think we have come at this, just to give you the reassurance, Deputy, in a very open-minded way. We have not just used the old tactics and to try and increase capacity on the summer programme, but we've really introduced a number of innovative processes last year which we really think have helped, and we think they're going to help this year. So I might ask Frank first to just give you that information, and then Brendan can talk to you about the gifted children and dyslexia, if that's okay.
Yeah, and I read the same report, and I met with the group around it, and we discussed, you know, some of the positive things, but also some of the experiences. And more than I said before, I think it's good that we hear from those parents. Yes, we had a significant increase, a 50% increase in special schools taking part in the scheme, and I think that was a real focus this year. You know, we ran a pilot for special schools, and we kind of looked at the practical and resource elements that were needed to assist schools to run a programme, and it jumped from 39 up to 59, which is more than has ever done it before. So I think that's really good. You know, the intention will be to continue that for next year, but obviously, you know, and I agree with you, the focus is on getting all those children some sort of access to the summer programme, and I think that's, as Martina was saying, you know, we've already started engaging on next year's programme. Again, we want to get it out even earlier than we did last year, which I think was February. We want to get it out as soon as possible, and we're already talking to stakeholders around things like, you know, looking at other groups that maybe could take on the summer programme. Our preference is for it to be in a school at all times and for the school to run it. But, you know, if that's not possible, then we'll look at other options, and we'll look at them quickly so that we have things in place as soon as possible for parents, because it's important that they get some sort of educational programme. You talked about the 2 weeks and the 4 weeks. Yes, our preference is also, you know, to run it for 4 or 5 weeks. I know some schools probably dipped their toe into the water. You know, a lot of the special schools ran it for the first time this year, and they ran it tentatively for 2 weeks. And you know, we from talking to some of the inspectors, you know, they've had really positive experiences. They've been able to draw down a lot of the staff off the portal that we put in place this year. So I think that's something that will continue to grow for next year, so that staffing was not an issue for them, and they were able to draw down staff across the country in those locations. And we'd be hoping to create synergies with the Department of Children as well, in terms of their own kind of services they provide then on top of the summer programme. So we're talking to all the stakeholders again, and we want to see this for all the children the same as yourself.
20 years ago, I had a conversation with a young person about novel War and Peace, plot development, characterisation, the whole usual thing. The child was 8 in second class, so they're definitely out there.
Yeah.
Children with exceptional abilities. If you look at the Education Act, children with special education needs are defined as being at both ends of the academic spectrum. We would hope and expect that in a school setting, that a young person with that level of exceptional ability or giftedness, that the teacher's response to the identified need would be appropriate, that differentiation of questioning and all the usual things would be the norm in terms of the way the teachers would engage with the young person. But the additional supports that have been provided to schools through the SET model, for example, the key principle that underpins that is that the child with the greatest level of need should get the greatest level of support. Now, I remember having a conversation about going back to that young child that I came across so those many years ago. The principal was concerned about that child, not because of academic ability. He was streets ahead of everybody else in the school. But he had difficulty in fitting in. He had difficulty in engaging with his peers. So the school was allocating resource appropriately to some of the additional support that was in the school in order to meet that need. And it was purely around social programs. It wasn't about academics, because that wasn't necessary at all. So, you know, we would hope and expect that schools would adopt that type of approach. It is also something that we're focusing on in the department at the moment. We have established a working group recently with regard to the provision of support and guidance for schools in respect of children with exceptional abilities. And I think it's important to say, when we talk about exceptional abilities, we're not just talking about academics here. You know, there are young people with exceptional ability in music, in art, in sport, and the whole range of activities in school. So there was, I don't know if you're aware of this, there was a draft guidance document issued to schools in 2007 by NCCA. It was only ever draft, though. So one of the things we've asked the group to look at in particular is that set of guidance that was produced for the schools at the time. Now, bearing in mind that we've had so many reform measures in our system since 2007, that certainly needs to be updated, and hopefully one of the outcomes of this work will be the provision of specific guidance for schools in this area. So that would mirror what is done in other jurisdictions as well.